We are so happy to have you all here tonight with us. I'm not going to delay anything, but I do need to do a couple things to get us going. Before we start the documentary 15 to Life, Kenneth's story, I want to welcome you to the Michigan Theater and thank them for hosting us. They've been great to work with. And I want to thank all of you for caring about this issue that we're facing here in our state and also across the nation. And of course, thank you for your support. We can't do it without you. Our panelists are great. We're going to have an awesome time after the film. And I also thank them for taking the time out of their busy day to be here with us tonight. Particularly want to give a shout out to those who have sponsored this event. A2 Awesome, Eastern Michigan University, College of Arts, Science, Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology. The National Lawyers Guild at the University of Michigan, and the Social Justice Council for the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor. All of these groups have come together and supported us in making this event happen, and we can't thank you enough from the bottom of our hearts. Well, what a slap in the face, right? It's deeper than what we thought. It's harder. It's hard for me to watch that. I have a 14-year-old kid, a boy. So give me a minute. I wish I had a joke right now. While we're getting settled and transitioned, I want to also thank the staff of the DRC and the volunteers and the Friends of Restorative Justice who have worked with us over about 3 or 4 months, if not longer, to make tonight happen. So I have to really thank them for this. Okay, so we transition into our panel discussion. I'm going to want to start with the panelists just introducing themselves and sharing their insight and their perspectives on this topic. So Deb, why don't you start and we'll work this way if that's okay? Okay.
Hi, my name's Deborah LaBelle and I'm an attorney. I practice in this state and in a few international forums. And my work is concentrated now on working with youth who are in detention and in prison. So I think I want to give a little background to where, and maybe lighten up a little bit about some of the progress we have made. About 10 years ago, right when Roper, the case which struck down the death penalty for youth under the age of 18 was decided by the US Supreme Court, a group of us, both internationally and in the United States, got together and we had a meeting and talked about what Roper meant in terms of saying that kids are different and we have to treat them differently no matter what they did, and that the focus was on who they were and not what their actions were, and that they were children. And talking both with people in the United States and people from Canada, and there were people from Mexico. It was a pretty broad group of about 20 people speaking about how the United States was the only country in the world, not only that it had the death penalty, but that had life without possibility of parole, and that put children routinely in prison and sentenced them for long virtual life sentences for their actions without considering their status and that they were children at all, morphing them into adults. And that we had a history in this country of neglecting children, and when children acted out or were taken by adults to commit crimes because of deep neglect, suspensions from schools, being out on the streets, that we as a society, instead of responding with some kind of understanding about what it is like to be a child who's out there abandoned and neglected, instead we punished. And we had deep discussions about whether we punished out of fear, whether we punished out of shame, but that there was a lack of recognition in the judiciary and in the community that these are children and that their child status, just as in Kenneth's case, were never considered at any time. And I'm thinking about that today. I spent actually about a few hours in the 15th District Court today. And I watched as child after child came up. There were children who were 17. There were children who were students here. I actually looked at the prosecution of some of the being black at U of M kids who for protesting. I looked at kids who were there for minors in possession. And not once, and I don't say this to demean the judge, who's actually a very good judge over there today, but the system didn't allow that judge at any point to say, what were you thinking? You know, you're a kid. You know, why were you doing this? There was no intervention. It was just misdemeanor, 90 days, or plea, probation, fines, and there was no involvement in them as kids. And we know they're kids, I mean, as parents and as people with memory. So I tell that story to say that when we started out with this and the whole Life Without Parole movement, as well as looking at youth who are serving virtual life, had to do with starting a dialogue about treating youth differently and recognizing for once our social responsibility for our children in this country, looking at how the worst of our issues in this country in terms of race and class get played out among our children as to who is in prisons, who's in adult prisons. In Michigan, there are thousands of kids who are in jails and prisons who are serving long sentences. Often, well, the majority for property crimes, and they have been treated as if they are adults, and that's why they're there. And I'll just pass one other thing on, because the magnitude of it and the way it affects our future. Our children, of course, I mean, it's a cliche to say they're our future, but we want them to rebel. We want them to push back. We want them to be safe, and we want to recognize them and give them space to be kids, to make mistakes and then come back into our community. And instead, we're locking them away. And about 6 months ago, I was in DC with a group of federal people from the State Department, people from the Department of Justice, and we asked a whole group of people if anyone really knew the numbers of our kids that were out of our community and in detention and in jails and in prisons, state and federal, and in detention centers for immigration. And no one knew. No one had even a sense of the number. One person from the federal government said, I think there's about 1 million. And somebody else said, well, I think it's about 200,000-300,000. And it's shocking in this country that we don't know where our kids are, and we don't know that they're being treated as adults, and we don't know how many right now are in the Washtenaw County Jail, in detention, and in Michigan prisons. Because we have turned away from them as children. And so I'm really happy to be here, happy to see so many people here to start a dialogue about how we can do things differently.
It should be on.
Yeah, I know. Okay. My name is I'm sorry. I'm so glad we started with Deb because she's so eloquent, and I think she's so eloquent because she's had to try such difficult cases. in court and be able to articulate that on behalf of her client, even when it is so upsetting. My name is Tim Connors. I am your judge, one of your judges. I'm very thankful for that opportunity and responsibility, and I, by request, have now been able to do that which I have been hoping to do for a number of years, and that is to be the presiding judge of the juvenile court. I know we're going to be able to get into some things and talk about it. Ms. LaBelle talked about lessons we can and should learn from those nations outside of our borders, because we should not be so arrogant or so proud to think that there isn't much that we can learn. I believe we can also learn from the nations inside of our borders, and by that I mean the 566 different tribal nations that our Congress has decided to recognize, to give them the dignity of their existence. And the reason I think we have much to learn there is because this nation has, as a result of governmental policies for a sustained period of time, treated two groups of our citizens in a way that is frankly criminal. One of those, of course, is the African American community, and you heard the statistics, and we see the disproportionate number of the effects of that. And it came out of and all you have to do is look at the law and the roots and the dark roots in the law, that when we decided to advance material wealth and property interests over that of human beings, we were able to demonize a group of people as a cheap labor source. And that has continued in many ways up through today and the effects. The second, and going to my point of why I think we need to look inside of our borders, the other population that is disproportionately represented is the Native American population. And because the federal government often prosecutes them, we see that even more in the federal system. Those numbers are likewise staggering. And the incidence of suicide rates and deep problems among that youth, like the African American youth, is likewise staggering in what it has done to our families. And the Native American experience is we wanted the land, and they were an inconvenient truth. And so we came up with various legal fictions to justify under the law why it was not a human being's land. It belonged to savages, and we just pushed them across the border. So, the challenge posited in the film that we have a responsibility to view our society in a way different than the path we are going is a challenge and a responsibility that we must take up. And some of you I know have heard about the Peacemaking Court, which is a kind of restorative justice. I believe in it deeply. And it isn't, I learned about it from indigenous roots, not only in this country, but indigenous roots outside the country. It is the same roots, the indigenous roots that Nelson Mandela talked about in the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. What I have learned from those, and I just spent time a couple weeks ago with a judge in Cake, Alaska. This is a tribal population in an island that the only way you can get there is by ferry. It takes 7 hours once a week, either from Sitka or Juneau. They first fought the Russians, then they fought the Americans. And the reason they went to peacemaking is because their youth, they had the highest incident of suicide rate among their teenagers. And the feds came in, and the state came in, and the experts came in, and the therapists came in, everybody came in, the kids kept killing themselves. And the judge finally said, this is our community, this is us, this is our survival, this is our responsibility. And they turned back to their indigenous roots in peacemaking. Similarly, in this state, tribal courts are doing that because their survival is so dependent on their ability to work through these issues. And in Red Hook, in Brooklyn, in an urban situation, that community, primarily African American, turned to it to see if it could work there, and it did work there. The point being is that we as a community need to look at it. What are the needs for us, and what can we do in a way that is different than this current path? Thank you. You got your own too.
Hello, my name is Calvin Evans. I'm the Human Resource Operations Manager for a company called Urban Ash. I'm on the Washtenaw County Workforce Development Board. I also serve as a violence intervention specialist for Wayne State Sinai Grace Hospital. January 29th of 2013, I was released from prison after serving 24 years. So I've been out of prison for approximately just over 2.5 years. I would like to kind of like put a face to everything that we have been watching. I'm Kenneth. I'm Kenneth's story. My mother was a dope fiend. She was a proud woman still. And in that pride, she refused to kind of admit to her failing me, her having failed me, if you will. Just like Kenneth's mom, she was unable to admit that she left him home alone, forcing him to be an adult, although he was a child. I never enjoyed childhood. I always had to be an adult. And so I'm saying this to say that violence isn't born in a vacuum. We just think that like these young youth that are acting out merely because they're young or because they're bad. So we demonize them and we stigmatize them, and ultimately what happens, they begin to act out of that thing in which we have imposed on them. That's my story. I was beat by my mother's boyfriend. I was beat like I was an adult. I'm 5, 6 years old. I watched my moms get beat by this same individual. So I had to come up and be the man, or feeling like I had to come up to be the man to take us up out of this condition. And so that led to me having to get shot in the mouth, that led to me being a drug dealer, that led to me getting stabbed, that led to my incarceration. I always knew that I was more though. I always knew that was more, and I was crying out to everyone to give me a hug. No one was there to give me a hug. No one was there to help me, or so I felt, because that same kind of pride and, sense of hopelessness that my mother was trying to hide was housed or stored in me. So I was proud, but at the same time I was hopeless, but I didn't want anyone to think that I was hopeless, so nobody could really reach out and help me. All this to say, I was convicted of having killed someone. I was convicted of second-degree murder. Here it is, Kenneth is convicted of 4 armed robberies, no one dies. I got 24 years, he was charged with 4 counts of life. That's kind of harsh when you find that I, who was charged with having committed murder, have been released after having served 24 years and made a successful transition. I'm a highly sought after public speaker now. And I am that missing link to help aid in the process of restoring justice amongst our youth. I have many individuals whom I deal with that come from out of the prison system that actually are engulfed in this process. One of my co-workers, the company in which I work for, 50% of our employees are from the ex-felon labor pool. One of my co-workers and I were talking about a guy named Charles Finch. Charles Finch got locked up at the age of 15 for being in the presence of someone who committed the murder. He wasn't charged with the murder, he was just present, an accessory, an aided and abettor sort of like thing. This was in 1976. Charles Finch is still in prison after 40 years. And within 40 years, he have only had one major misconduct in the prison system. So in 40 years in prison, he have only gotten in trouble one time. Is this the place that we want someone to be? Is there other opportunities? That is the sort of thing that I feel like I'm charged with the responsibility to expose, because as I have come out and made a successful transition after incarceration, so can individuals like himself, so that we can help these young youths who believe that it is cool to be going out following these individuals who are misguiding them. So, having said that, I'm glad you guys came out to hear what's going on.
My name is Brian Sellers, and I am a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Eastern Michigan University. I started out thinking I wanted to go down a path of becoming a lawyer when I was finishing my undergraduate degree. And before I decided to jump down and plunge into law school, I actually started working for an internship with the district attorney's office and started my master's program at UNC Charlotte, which is in North Carolina. And one of the cases that we dealt with, which was very hard for me to understand, was a case of felony murder where a group of 14, 16-year-olds were robbing a place, and one of them decided that they didn't want witnesses. And he decided to execute the witnesses. Well, all of them were charged with felony murder accomplice and were being tried as adults, facing life sentences with this outcome. And looking at them, just seeing them in the courtroom, they didn't understand or comprehend what was going on. Asking them, do you understand what this means for you? They thought it was more like, oh, we're just going away for a while if we get sentenced, just like boot camp or going to day camp or summer camp. And it really intrigued me, because when we think of kids and we see them, yes, we get outraged by something that happens as a dangerous or violent crime. And we start to focus on the individual. And we never sit back and try and look, well, where did that individual come from, as Deb had said? Who are they? What else is going on in their lives? And we lose sight of the fact that they're still children. And all of the scientific research, when you look at behavioral science, social science, neuroscience, we know for a fact that kids are still developing well into their mid-20s. And that means that they have cognitive deficits when it comes to making rational thought. It means that they have psychosocial deficits, which they're more likely to be impulsive. They don't perceive long-term consequences, that they live in the immediate, what's happening right now in the short term. They're highly susceptible to peer influence because they're seeking autonomy, they're seeking acceptance. And that pressure can push them into situations or pull them into situations where they're not ready to actually understand the gravity of what can come as consequences. And another thing about youth is that they don't have the capacity to extricate themselves from criminogenic environments. Like with Kenneth, and over 30% of lifers come from adverse concentrated disadvantage, adverse poverty, okay? About 80% of them have dealt with some form of physical abuse or neglect. And those numbers are very high, especially among young girls who have experienced sexual abuse in the home and victimization. That kind of trauma at a young age can really affect a youth, and it doesn't allow them to think rationally. One other thing is the fact that youth's brains are still developing. Their white matter, gray matter, until they're in their 20s. The frontal lobe is what governs our higher order functioning. It helps us to understand, what is right and wrong. It helps us to understand and perceive long-term consequences. It helps us to regulate our amygdala response for threats that we perceive. And kids don't have that full development yet. But when we look at them as offenders, we see them as rational agents, or we're saying that there's nothing else we need to consider. They did the crime, so they should do the time. But what we know is that these probably shouldn't even be tried as adults. Because of their developmental immaturity, they don't have the same legal competency that adults have in similar situations. They can't, begin to provide a proper defense. And as you saw in the case with Kenneth, he didn't know how to navigate the system. It's a whole lot of legalese. He had probably an overworked public defender that was not capable of probably arguing that case for him and wanted to plead out. So these kids are really at a disadvantage, and we know that they can be redeemable, because when we look at over 500 different studies that have evaluated effective programming for youth, when we look at what works, deterrence-based or retributive-based programs actually increase recidivism. They increase the likelihood they're going to reoffend if they're released. And the ones that do work are rehabilitative in nature or restorative in nature, ones that actually get at the heart of the problem and unearth these issues that not only include the individual youth, but their family, their community, their neighborhood, which they're all nested in and intimately tied to. And if we don't bring that myopic focus that we have on the youth and bring it back and see what our communities are doing and basically dragging them to zones of social abandonment, then we're really going to lose sight of what they can become as citizens, and that they are still redeemable and their character can still be restored.
Thank you. Thank you all. The next question I'm going to direct to Deb. I know that she's been a part of some litigation addressing the juvenile lifers here in Michigan. We know that there are about 350 lifers serving here in the state of Michigan. Can you speak about the work that you've done to change that for them and maybe to retroactivate those sentences?
Sure. In Michigan, Michigan's one of a few states that had an automatic mandatory life without parole for youth age 14 and up who were convicted of various homicide crimes. So aiding and abetting and felony murder, meaning these kids didn't actually commit a homicide, accounts for over a third of the kids that are serving a mandatory life without possibility of parole in Michigan. That's unusual, actually, because most states require at least a homicide, except for Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, were the big four in which have the majority of kids serving life without possibility of parole in the country. Actually, we account for, those four states account for about 75%. Florida's gotten rid of, since this film, their life without parole system. Even Texas has gotten rid of their life without parole system for kids, but Michigan is sticking hard on this. And Michigan is one of the states that said even when the Supreme Court, one of the positive things I have to say is from 2005, getting rid of the death penalty, till now, the U.S. Supreme Court has been pretty much pushing the issue that kids have to be treated differently in the criminal justice system. They've decided that there cannot be mandatory life without parole. You have to look at each kid's individual circumstances before you decide what's the appropriate punishment. They've decided that kids can't be held to the same standard in interrogations as adults because they don't understand what's going on in the same way and don't understand Miranda rights. And yesterday they heard the case of whether states like Michigan, who have refused to apply the Supreme Court rule to those who are serving the sentence, must do it, and it's a retroactivity decision. So Michigan said, okay, we have to follow it in the future. We have to look at individual circumstances in the future, but for the 362 kids who have already been sentenced, they have to continue that punishment till they die, and has refused to address that. So that issue went back to the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday. And so there'll be a decision as to whether Michigan has to relook at those. And so many of them have served, so many of them are Kenneths. I mean, I actually wonder, were people surprised that the judge in this film did what he did? You know, and you have to say, how do you reach judges like that who are going to decide in Michigan and who decide kids' fate every day? You know, he heard about the brain science that Brian talked about. He heard that he was 14. He heard that Kenneth clearly wasn't the mover and shaker here. He saw what kind of home life he had, and he even said he's rehabilitated. And yet he decided that he had to keep, as a kind of vengeance and punishment, that he had to keep staying in prison for another 30 years. And he knows as a judge that, he was at no risk. I mean, most crimes, I think 99% of all crimes are committed before the age of 35 in this country. I think that's a general statistics. And kids age out of criminality. Those kind of things they don't do again. So, one of the tasks that I think we have as a community is to take this moment when, for example, in Michigan, they're deciding whether to finally treat 17-year-olds as kids instead of adults. We're one of 4 states that continue to treat 17-year-olds automatically as adult for anything. And if you want to hear how bizarre that is, so in Michigan, you have to go to school till you're 18. And usually, if you don't go to school, you're a truant. But if you're 17, truancy is a juvenile crime. So if you're 17, prosecutors in Michigan are thinking, well, what crime can we charge that 17-year-old as an adult for being truant from school? Because we can't treat him as a kid. So, I mean, the system is really, in this country, is quite bizarre in this state. So right now, the legislature is considering whether raise to age, whether to not put kids age 13 to 18 directly in adult prison, which we do right now, and a series of other changes in our laws that start to get at the issue of treating kids like they are, kids. And so I think it's a really important moment as we work to get those who are out, so many Kenneths. I have a client, and other people have clients who have served 25 years with not a single misconduct. Not a single misconduct, and that's really hard to do in prison when being out of place or being insolent gets you a misconduct, or not eating your food quick enough. So, in looking at this, I think that we as a community have to start pushing those people who are stakeholders, our judges, our prosecutors, our legislatures, to say, listen, these are our kids, and we want to invest our money not in the prisons. We want to invest them in schools. We want to invest them and we can do this. I mean, there have been counties, I'll just take one more second, but there have been counties who have done this across the country, in which the state has said, okay, we're going to give you half of the money that it costs to send the kids you're sending to, in Oregon they did this, to send to prison, because each kid costs us about $40,000 a year that you send to prison. And for every kid you don't send next year, we're going to give you $40,000, but if you send a kid, you're going to have to pay it out of the county budget. In 1 year, that county reduced the amount of kids it sent to prison by 90%. By 90%. Because what they did, they hired extra after-school people for detention for kids who had been kicked out of school. They said, okay, we're going to start programs there. We got a bunch of money to do it. By 90%, those kids didn't go to prison. And so we can do this. Educators, judges, thoughtful people can do this if we have some will here.
Thank you. Wow. Got a lot of work to do. Wow. Brian, as we were preparing for tonight, we had lots of conversations, and one of the things that struck me was the conditions that juveniles live in once they are sentenced to the adult prison. Can you touch on that a little bit, just to give an illustration for us in the audience?
Well, the first thing is, if they're in an adult prison, they are at an increased risk for victimization already. And that victimization is not only physical, but possibly sexual. And because of this, it's very likely that youth could be put into integrated segregation, which is solitary confinement. And when you're a young kid and you're in solitary confinement, basically isolated for upwards of 20 to 23 hours of the day by yourself, that can start to cause you to develop deep anxiety, feelings of depression, psychoses that weren't actually there before, but if there was any pre-existing issues of mental state, they get exacerbated. We see that this heightens the risk that youth are going to become not only more violent towards others, but also more violent towards themselves, more likely to inflict harm. And this can be devastating in results of kids committing suicide in prison. Another thing that you noticed in the film, that Kenneth wasn't offered a lot of programming. He had to seek it out. He begged for it, actually. They weren't going to give him a GED program. And the reason for this, and I hope you listened to that, was that they thought it was a waste of money. Why waste money? Because he's going to die. When we talk about these life sentences, it's natural life. He's there to die, and you get 4 of them. Why waste money on someone? Why would we give them that? I think the Supreme Court changes the rules. But do you think that that changes how programming is done in the correctional facilities? Not necessarily. About 62% of lifers are denied programs because of the policies that exist in the states and within the correctional facilities, because they don't see it as beneficial. But that's perhaps the best thing we could be doing, is giving them education, giving them interventions to help with substance abuse issues and addiction, giving them help with dealing with anger, giving them help to build and restore relationships with family and social supports that are going to help them if they do reenter society. Give them vocational, give them educational skills that help them get a good job, to be productive citizens. And it goes much further than that, because there's so many social barriers that exist when they are released that we have to also address. But it starts to go back to this issue. What is it that we value? If we're spending anywhere $45,000 on a youth, and some estimates say even as high as $80,000, and that number increases as they get older, because elderly inmates cost even more for their care while they're in prison. I mean, we're talking about 2,500 people. If we estimate what that true cost is, it's $6.2 billion to keep them in prison for life. That's what we want to spend our taxpaying dollars on, when we only spend $11,000 per student in school. $11,000 compared to anywhere from $45,000 to $80,000 on incarcerating them. It's starting to show where we want to put our money. Is that where you want to put your money? I don't think it's well spent, because it's not investing in the right aspects of youth. It's saying that they're not worth anything else, and then it's basically locking them up and throwing away the key. So the idea that the judge says, yeah, you're rehabilitated and I commend you for your remorse and everything else, but it's not enough. It shows that he doesn't believe in rehabilitation or restoring the character of youth. No, he wants irrevocable incapacitation. He wants vengeance and retribution. And this is something we have to come to terms with in our society. Is that the best value to embrace when it comes to our children? And I think it's not, and I know it's not.
Thank you, Brian. So it sounds like restorative work has a place in this conversation, and I know that Judge Connor has been at the forefront of peacemaking, the Peacemaking Court, which is a restorative model. Judge, can you share with the community what that really means and what it looks like?
I can.
Okay.
I'd be happy to, but I know we are limited on time. And the gentleman sitting to my immediate, I'm here. This gentleman, we need to hear from more than me. And if we have time for that question, I'm happy to go to.
Okay, so I'll move on. Calvin, you've talked about your transition to the community, and you are an amazing person. I am really honored to even know you. Talk about what it takes in a community to help others make that transition. How do we support your efforts, your vision?
First, I want to say this to the youth, because I feel like I have a responsibility to them. And so there are many of them in the audience, and I even spoke with a couple of them. One of the things that got me caught up in the condition that I got caught up in is that I wanted to be cool. And so in trying to be cool, I found myself following individuals who were cool, and these people who were cool were actually individuals who were doing things that were negative, if you will. So I did 24 years in prison because I didn't tell. Not because I actually committed the crime, but because I didn't tell. And so when detectives came to me to tell them what happened, I still refused to tell my story. I thought that there was going to be some miraculous happenings in the courts that would allow me to be released because I didn't do the crime. But the courts wanted to know who did the crime, and I refused to tell because that wouldn't make me cool. You know, how would I be able to live with myself? And then in some capacity, from the environment which I come from that's dangerous, I could actually lose my life. So I'm saying that in trying to be cool, what actually happens is that you can throw away your life as I did. So to your question though, what actually has helped is that I found in this community in particular that there was a community effort that was taking place. And the community effort that was taking place is everybody was trying to help individuals who were trying to help themselves, who were taking responsibility for their actions. And so the more I ran into those individuals, the more I found that networking system, that energy. And it allowed me to freely express myself. But my work began while I was incarcerated. It didn't begin prior to my incarceration. So I took ownership. I believe that until you take complete ownership of your life will continue to bring you into experiences that make you take action. So if you don't take ownership of it, you're going to continue to bump your head. So I took action and I took ownership of my actions. And that is what allowed other people to kind of like embrace me and kind of assist me and kind of like guide me and kind of like mentor me. And so I owe it to those individuals who guide and mentor me to do the same sorts of things. So I guide and mentor the youth or individuals like myself. So it's a collaborative effort between peers and community. Those who believe in the cause, those who believe in the work, those who are committed to it. People that are in here. We have people here that are willing to help, but in what capacity can I help you help me, help us?
Thank you. Thank you. So we got work to do, y'all. So we get some more Calvins. Can I come back to you, Judge?
Sure. What,
The question, we've heard from all the speakers talk a little bit about the restorative approach in this effort, and I'd just like for you to talk a little bit more about the peacemaking that you've spearheaded at our court.
Yeah, I could talk about that, but I think the root of all this is what we've been touching on. And why don't I just address this from institutions? The court is a small part of the responsibility in this. And as Calvin was talking about, what I believe, what I have learned from peacemaking, is that we're all born in through our mothers. We put our trust into our families put their trust into our community, and our communities put our trust in institutions. And trust means responsibility. So when we have that collective trust given to us as an institution, we have that collective responsibility to help. It has been translated that collective trust means power and authority. And the disconnect happens when institutions start talking about what's good for the institutions or the individuals, what's good for me, rather than the work and the responsibility back out. That core thinking results in people of positions of decision-making reflecting the kind of thing we saw in the film today. You have to ask yourself at the beginning, we are taught as new judges, man, we are taught how to do it and how fast to do it and what forms to fill out. But I know institutionally when we start to ask ourselves the question, what is it we are trying to accomplish? And I mean really ask that question, because that exposes the value. And then we say, why is that the value? And then the why behind the value. And I have found within my own institution and within the other institutions I deal with and within ourselves individually that it starts there. People get very defensive when those questions start to get asked. But until we do it, we're going to keep doing dumb things.
I'm going to let that be the final note. Thank you again for being here. Panelists, we can't appreciate you enough for the work that you're doing, for the information that you're sharing, keeping us informed and educated. This will end this part of our event tonight. I'll be in trouble if I don't say this. Please, please keep this conversation alive. Follow us in social media, hashtag DRC Peace. There's a call to action, change.org petition out in the lobby. Please feel free to sign up. What we're signing up for and what we're asking you to support is making restorative practices a viable alternative as we deal with juvenile justice. I see your hand. And also, if you want to keep in touch with the Dispute Resolution Center, go to our website, sign up for our newsletters. We want to keep this conversation going. I promise that we will reconvene and get more information. Thank you very much. Around the corner at Savaz on State Street, join us with the panelists and have more to say.